Wow, that's so humbling. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you. I did not know that story. Thank you, Justin. It's such an honor to be paired with you today and to have been in conversation with you in these past few months leading up to this. And thanks to all my familiar friends, fam, who are in the space today for coming out on such short notice. I typically don't like to publicize these things, but Justin and I had such a great conversation leading up to this. And I was just like, I never feel like this prepared to like talk about something and feel disengaged with a thought partner. And so I felt like, hey, if you're gonna come to a presentation, like come to this one. So I appreciate it. Okay, so this presentation is called Plantations Are Not Forests. It's meant to be literal. And it's not a metaphor. And I want to actually begin with a bit of a thought exercise for you all. I'm sorry, I'm being a teacher today. But I want to take 3 minutes to have you speak to each other in pairs, whatever feels comfortable, to answer whatever comes to mind off the top of the dome in response to these two questions. So one is, what are the differences between a plantation and a forest? And two, what do those differences have to do with time? And again, this may be all new to you, and that's fine. I'm just curious about your responses. So I'm going to time you so we stay on time here, have time for discussion, and go. Okay, let's come back together. Let's come back. Let's bring it back. Let's bring it back. All right, so I'm gonna take just a couple of minutes to hear some of your responses. Anybody want to share? Now we're having lots of discussion. Thank you, Justin, for getting us started.
So, a plantation is a violent, managed, extractive, depleted landscape, and a forest is not.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So Justin said that, paraphrasing because I never can remember verbatim, but that a plantation is a violent, extractive landscape, and a forest is not. Yeah. Okay. And Anna says that it's ordered toward an economic end. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, and plantations being oriented toward the economic end don't have the same ecological function because they're homogeneous, generally the same species, generally the same age, generally no understory, whereas forests have that biodiversity that benefits habitat, carbon cycling, water cycling,
Mhm.
actual functioning landscape beyond economic diversity.
Yeah, thank you. So a forest, in contrast to a plantation, has sort of is a living ecosystem with biodiversity and interconnectedness, carbon cycling, and the like. Yeah, thank y'all. Any one, maybe one final reflection? Maybe the connection with time. What's the connection with time? Does anyone have?
I said that the plantation is more limited in time because it sort of comes quickly and violently and
Mhm.
destroys what was there previously. But then at a certain point, it sort of has to be taken back over
Mhm.
by nature, by biodiversity at a certain point. So it's more limited in time. And I
Yeah.
also said they both have whale bones underneath them.
Excellent. Awesome. Yeah. Sarah said that the plantation is more limited in time because it comes quickly, it comes violently, it exhausts the soil and the landscape and sort of destroys what existed before it. And yeah, and plantation has a much longer kind of life. Thank you. Thank you all for that. Um, you did. Yeah, we're gonna talk more, to talk more about it. So I want to start us off with a quote from the Canadian, Afro-Canadian poet Dionne Brand in her new book called Nomenclature. And this is a line from a poem from that collection, but she also iterated it, right, in a recent interview. And she says, "I don't believe in time, I do believe in water." And I think I wanted to give that line today as a kind of starting place, or actually not even a starting place, a sort of pickup from where Justin left us off with today, that really beautiful time spiral that he presented. And water is present and essential, right, to each one of those multi-million year, right, epochs, right, that epochs of the earth. And so when Dionne Brand says that she doesn't believe in time, right, time is a construct that we have created for ourselves. And has existed in different kinds of iterations across human history. But water, right, has been around this entire time and cycles, even now, right, cycles at a scale that is sometimes perceptible to us and sometimes not in the sort of shorter time scale, but in this sort of longer, right, scales that Justin was talking about in his presentation. The water comes and it goes and it comes and it goes and it's coming, right, again. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, first, to give you sort of introduction into how I got into thinking about plantations and forests to begin with. And then we'll talk a little bit about time, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what I think the forest is, right? And why I think a forest is really important important framework for our time. The stretch of Highway 80 between Montgomery and Selma is a lush landscape almost unbroken by trees. The discernible crops, like the cotton for which the Alabama Black Belt region is infamously known, serve as a decoy of sorts for the crop that takes up the most literal space in the state, timber. Approximately 70% of the land area, or roughly 23 million acres of Alabama, is timberland, 94% of which is owned by non-industrial private forest landholders. 62% of these lands in Alabama are absentee owned or possessed by landowners who do not reside on or near the land. The visual deceptiveness of the timber industry's presence is achieved by the strong resemblance of tree plantations to forests. Forests are complex, self-sustaining, biodiverse ecosystems which, in addition to providing sustenance to a variety of life forms, including our own, also provide necessary climate regulation and natural barriers against weather events like hurricanes, flooding, and fires. By contrast, tree plantations are monocrop landscapes that are difficult to support without chemical inputs, such as pesticides and fertilizers, which are reliant on the petrochemical industry. The trees are planted in rows, and the plantations provide very little biodiversity and viable habitat and sustenance for forest wildlife. Tree plantations are a current iteration of several modes of capitalist relations to Alabama's indigenous forest landscape, much of which was initially cleared in the 19th century for the cotton economy, and, as I just found out, is also one of the world's top sites to find ancient sea monsters. The Alabama Black Belt was under what's now the Gulf of Mexico, which was then blended with the Pacific Ocean, in the Cretaceous period, which was roughly 65 million years ago. So a good deal before the Pliocene. And so the fossils and the fertilizer, right, that created that fertile Black Belt soil that made the cotton industry so profitable in that area of Alabama is a direct, right, result from those histories. For many Black people living in the Black Belt, the site of their ancestors' enslavement, mainly on cotton plantations, the contemporary timber economy signals a different iteration of plantation power. Instead of the planter class controlling land and labor in place, most of the owners in the timberland and the Black Belt and the larger state live outside of the region and the state and employ relatively few people on a consistent basis. The impact of such remote control plantation power persists in its constraints over Black communities' choices for the future of the places where they have long built safety, solidarity, and power. Nevertheless, the freedom praxis of Black communities cultivated for generations preserve the memory of these ecosystems and the relations that are integral to the ultimate physical survival of the region, particularly as industrial extractions precipitate compounding social and ecological consequences. Okay, so that's an introduction to this landscape. The Alabama Black Belt is not alone in this. This is also happening, as I'll discuss in a minute, in eastern North Carolina, right? And some of the same landscapes. This region, you may not know, is called the world's wood basket. We export apparently more timber than any other place in the world, which I did not know. I kind of thought was the Amazon, but not true. This place is just as intimately, right, linked to the timber industry and economy as it was to the cotton industry. Okay, so what is plantation time? I'm going to talk about plantation time, and I'm going to talk about forest time today. My introduction to what I'm calling plantation time actually began some years ago. When I was writing my senior thesis on Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. These are two giants of the Black freedom movement of the mid-20th century. Fannie Lou Hamer was born in Mississippi and to sharecroppers and became the first delegate for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was challenging the Mississippi Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. She was a massive freedom rights organizer against plantation power in Mississippi. And she got her start because she could read and write as a plantation timekeeper. And I have looked around and around in depth for an actual definition of a plantation timekeeper, and I can't actually find one. If anyone has like a succinct definition of all the things that plantation timekeepers do, please do let me know. But by context, what I've gathered that a plantation timekeeper does is it records the labor and productive output of, in Fannie Lou Hamer's case, sharecroppers, right, on the land. And in an oral history, Fannie Lou Hamer talked about how when she was about 6 years old, she was playing in the fields around her house, and one of the planters came up to her and asked her if she wanted to pick cotton. And she said, I don't know if I want to pick cotton. He was like, well, if you can pick 30 pounds of cotton by the end of this week, I will take you to the commissary up the street and you can get some Cracker Jacks and you can get some other candies. And so she was incentivized by that to pick 30 pounds of cotton. And she was like, little did I know that that was going to become my life. It was like, I came back the next week and he was like, now I want you to pick 40 in a week, right? And so plantation time is, right, like not limited, right, to this particular period of time that Fannie Lou Hamer is talking about. It is a throwback directly into slavery, right? A throwback directly into the histories of how the indigenous forest lands of places like the Alabama Black Belt, the Mississippi Delta, and High Country, Eastern North Carolina, were leveled, right, for the purpose of this extractive, right, production that intimately, right, tied Black folks to land through their labor, through forms of extractive labor. And so I think about plantation time as this sort of mechanistic relationship to time where your life is determined, right, and highly structured by your labor, whether it's wage labor or not, right, and how much that you can produce. And your worth and your value in the society, right, under plantation time is intimately structured by the level of output, how valuable you are to a ruling planter class. And so a few years ago, back in 2020, I became more intimately aware of this sort of, it's not new, right? The timber industry is centuries old, but a newer iteration of the timber industry in North Carolina through work that I was doing with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And so here is a photo um, of the Enviva biomass plant in Northampton County, North Carolina. If you know it, it's right on the border with Virginia. It is it Roanoke Rapids? Is that right? Yeah, around, yeah, exactly. So in that region, heavily forested area that has been leveled in various ways just in the past 10 years by the biomass industry. And this industry really caught my imagination because I mean, you know, the paper industry, the lumber industry, all of those industries have very similar extractive function. The difference with this industry is that it's sold as green energy, right? This is sold as renewable, as a kind of environmental good that will help us to ultimately get out of the worst effects of climate change. And I'll show you another. So this is so yeah, all of those, like those are trees, like that's stacks and stacks, right, of trees that are basically ground into what we call wood pellets, biomass. You may have used them for a cookout, right? Like you see them in the Lowe's, right? They're in bags. Like they're not a new thing. But the new thing is that now they're being used to as a substitute for coal and coal-fired power plants. So they are mostly being exported to Europe to meet Europe's, the EU's climate change goals. So yeah, very familiar, right? So I'll talk to you a little bit about this cycle of biomass energy. You know, the idea is that, what happened here? It's showing up for me here. Okay.
It's still on, but it may have gotten tired.
Oh, no.
I think if you unplug it.
Okay. I'll just keep talking. Okay. Okay, thank you. So the idea, right, is that as we know, trees, as they have been framed, and it's true, right? Like it's not true. It's just the framing of trees as carbon sinks and stores, right? And so because we can grow trees theoretically, right, the idea is that if we cut down trees, right, to then burn them instead of coal, we can, unlike with fossil fuels, sort of easily renew, right, renew this feedstock, right, of biomass by planting new trees and then essentially harvesting them after 30 to 40 years, okay? So it's this is the framework, right, that has been in place around biomass for the last 10 to 15 years. And what I'll tell you is that a lot of the externalities, right, the sort of harmful impacts of what it means to level a forest and to replant it with a monocrop are not included, right, in this sort of calculation of what biomass does. And one of the major impacts that became apparent to me through my work with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network is the actual impacts of the the biomass factories, which are they're co-located with the, adjacent to or very near the forests, right, that are being leveled. And of course, uh, disproportionately or overwhelmingly really located in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, mostly Black communities. And so this, I think, is, another version, right, or a continuation of an idea about or experience of plantation time, because rather than, right, maintaining a forest for all of its purposes, right, including the carbon storage, you're leveling, right, these ecosystems and pretending essentially to replant them as though they're the same thing, and ignoring all of the other kinds of impacts that come with it. So what does plantation time feel like? So these are quotes from community members in Black community in Northampton County that's located right adjacent to the Enviva power plant. And they were sold, right, a story from Enviva that this would bring jobs. It's a very, typical story, right? This is going to bring jobs, but it's also clean energy. So it's not going to pollute, right, your community. It's not going to poison you. And it's totally false. Silverline Alston says the noise, the banging during all hours of the night. The wood pellet plant goes 24/7, 365. And so it's like grinding of trees, constantly trucks, right, bringing the lumber in. Belinda Joyner, who is an organizer with Clean Water North Carolina and is connected to the Environmental Justice Network, one of the main organizers against this industry. She says, we have a gentleman that lives in the area and he says he has to wash his car every 3 days and power hot wash his house every 3 months. And that's the stuff that comes from Enviva. There's a young man that lives out there that says he doesn't cook out anymore because he can see the residue falling from the sky. And then Mr. Richie Harding, who doesn't live right next to Enviva, but lives close to the forest that they are leveling for the wood pellets. There's been a high increase in the amount of animals, bobcats, black bears, coyotes, the sightings more frequent in the Gaston area. So he is having these sort of wildlife encounters in his backyard because these wildlife have been displaced. I've kind of gone through a little bit, I'm just trying to be mindful of time, gone through with you about some of the reasons why this doesn't work. But I want to just sort of point to the two rationales in the center here. The European Union claims that carbon neutrality is achievable through biomass, but they've created a loophole where the imported biomass is not included in their own carbon emissions, right? So when they burn the biomass, they are like, we don't count the carbon there because the US should count the carbon on our side. And of course, the US is not counting the carbon on our side, right? And then more recently, the science has sort of caught up that biomass at the point of combustion, right? So when it's in the coal-fired power plant, emits actually more carbon than coal because it's less efficient, right? So you have to have more of it to achieve the same amount of energy, okay? It's a quote from Catherine Eglin from Gulfport, Mississippi, chair of NAACP's Environmental Climate Justice Committee, which I feel like hits the nail on the head. If you look at the map of the wood pellet trade states and the former cotton trade states, they are the same. The UK ignored the human rights abuses of the cotton trade with slavery, and now they are imperiling the descendants of that same population with wood pellets. The US South also happens to be the most climate vulnerable region in the nation. Okay, so I wanted to, as I was doing this research, more and more getting more and more agitated, right, about climate change, but also just about these sort of extractive industries that are being put in place in the name of saving us from climate change. I wanted to think more about what the value of the forest is, right? Really thinking about what are forests and why are they important beyond this question of carbon, right? Because from every angle, honestly, right, in our climate conversations, people will say biodiversity, right? But they won't talk about life. They won't talk about cultural significance. They won't talk about what the forest has done, continues to do, and will do, right, forever and ever, right, if we keep them in place. And so I went into a deep dive, and I wanted to understand, if I had some understanding now of what plantation time was, right? What is forest time? And what I found, you should know that I think from the introduction, I study, in particular, I'm very interested in Black folks' relationships to landscapes, the kinds of places they create, the cultural significance of space. And I had never really thought through what Black folks' relationship is to the woods, right, to forests, other than the kinds of horror stories, right, of lynchings, right, and various forms of violence. And so I started to do some archival work. And here's some of what I found in online, but then also big shout out to the Schomburg Center for study in for research in Black culture in Harlem for some of these images. So what I argue is that the forests have been co-conspirators in Black freedom from the beginning of our presence on these shores. The forests that had to be leveled, that were leveled by hand, right, by enslaved peoples in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, were leveled by hand by these enslaved laborers to create the plantations, but there was still forest left. And those forests actually became spaces of refuge and escape, and spaces where folks could practice religion, as we see here, this image that I can't find the artist for, so if you happen to know, it's called the Hush Harbor. So these were spaces where time shifted, relationship to time shifted. It was a respite, right, from the plantation. It was a space where people may have escaped for temporarily or permanently in the case of maroon communities. It was also a space where, important rituals could happen, like this funeral. A lot of these are undated. They're just part of the digital archive of the Schomburg. There were also celebrations, right? Here's a festival in 1851. All of these, right, connected intimately, right, with these living landscapes. In addition to that, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A, because I know I want to make sure that we have time for this. The connections to lifeways and foodways were really critical, right? The enslaved peoples, right, who were able to escape into these forests or even just go into the forest for brief respite, right, learned a lot about medicines, right, about foods that could supplement their diets. They cultivated land in those forests as well. And those forests were maintained the kind of density that they did through what Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote the book Breeding Sweetgrass, calls these sort of intimate channels of communication, right? We don't have densely populated forests without the kinds of underground networks, right, of fungi and sediment and sort of life bridgeways and networks, right, that maintain that kind of forest. That kind of density, right, that kind of landscape was essential for escape, right? It was essential for respite. It was essential for carving out these spaces. And even post-emancipation, right? Tons of stories about juke joints in the woods when I was in Lowndes County, right? The spaces of respite from sharecropping, right? From any kind of extractive labor on the plantation, always a respite for plantation time. And then, of course, you know, as all of these sort of joyful, right, cultural, and really critically important rituals and practices were happening in the forests, cultivated by Black folks across generations, across time periods. There was always, right? So in the archive, I found an equal, if not more, right? Illustrations of lynchings, right, and violences. I'm not sharing those. But what I will share is, right, this image of the slave patrol, right, patrolling the forests. And it's always, right, to cut that time off, right? It's always to extract, to put back onto the plantation, come back to plantation time. And so forest time is a lifeline, right? Forest time is spaciousness. It is where we can actually be, to actually, it is a direct link to what I would call freedom. And so now, just to wrap up, so the parallel images, right, of the slave patrols into the forests that, you know, are unknown, just sort of unknown forests in this illustration, have direct parallels, right, to what Atlantans are now fighting, the extraction and leveling of the Welauni forest for the building of Cop City, right, which is, you know, 381 acres of essentially domestic military training facility that will train cops on all sorts of more efficient ways to kill Black people. Okay, like, and will do so, right, as they always have, right, at the expense not only of the people, right, but of the ecosystems that give us life. So I want to just end here, just in honor, right, of Manuel Tortuguita Terán, who was killed by police while defending the forest, and just reflect on these sort of connections, back to Justin's piece about the forests which come from the oceans, right, which could not have, you know, come about if not for the water that came before it, and the intimate, right, interconnectedness of these ecosystems and our relationships to it. And so I'll end again with a quote from Dion Brand: "I don't believe in time, I do believe in water." Thank you.